Hi, and welcome to today's Q&A session of pianoTV. So today I wanted to tackle the topic of moving through method books and grade levels at a really fast, accelerated pace. And I want to weigh the pros and cons of this and share with you some of my experiences from teaching over the last 10 years and what I tend to see in my studio. So let's get started. So this question comes from Ripcon, and I'm really sorry, I probably mispronounced your name, who asks, I am about to finish Alfred's book level 1 in a month and a half. Is there anything I'm doing wrong? Perhaps you could discuss this kind of thing in your next video. I am afraid to skip something important. So I wanted to answer this question, but I've been asked this question so many times and in so many different ways that I felt like it was finally worth talking about. A lot of people will say things like, oh, I'm playing grade 8 music after 2 years, or, oh, I raced through my method books, and I wanted to kind of explain my position on the matter. So a comparison I want to make is with the traditional school system. So here in Canada, the regular school system is 12 years, it's 12 grades, and then there's a 13th year, which is kindergarten. And if you were an adult and you'd never been to school, but you weren't like stupid, you like had some knowledge, but you just never actually went to a formal school, you would almost definitely rapidly progress through kindergarten first few grades. And probably by about grade 6, your progress would start to slow down a little bit and it would start to even out. It just depends on, what kind of basics and stuff you were comfortable with. So maybe you could get through, like, say, the first 6 grades of school in like 1 or 2 years, but then it would take you 4 to 6 years to finish the remaining 6 grades of school. I feel like the same thing is true of music. So some people can zoom through all of the beginner stages if they are really dedicated and they work hard and if their coordination is decent. Some people start out with better coordination than other people. So if your physiology isn't working against you, then you can make this kind of rapid progress, and that's pretty normal. But what I unfortunately see a lot are people who just completely bypass the entire intermediate range of piano. So it's like they go from minuet and G all the way to Chopin waltzes and nocturnes and nothing in the middle. It's like from 0 to 100, and they're skipping all of these years of learning. So that would be being in grade 4 of a regular school and being like, you know what, I think I got all the basics down. Time to go to high school. It just doesn't make sense to skip that much learning. So for people who do that, entirely bypass a big chunk of their musical development, you can still learn challenging pieces. Just like if you were to skip all those grades in school, you could still, study hard and pass and figure everything out. But you're going to be working so much harder because you're going to just have natural gaps in your knowledge. Now, I don't think it's unreasonable to go through a method book in a month and a half, as per your example. But if you were my student, I would have a few questions for you, and we'll talk about these questions one at a time here. But I would ask you how much time you were spending practicing, how long you were working on a piece before moving on to the next one. And I would be wondering too, how well you learned the music. So were you learning it to an okay level, 75%, or were you, spending a lot of time really perfecting things, getting things closer to 100%? So for the first question, how much time do you spend practicing? If this was one of my students, I would probably expect the answer to be about an hour a day. Now, the exception to this would be if they're very gifted and just naturally progress through quickly, and that does happen. But the second alternative that does happen too is that there's been some cutting corners and skipping over of things, maybe not putting in as much effort. So that's why that's always the first question I would ask. The next question I would ask is, how long would you typically work on a piece before moving on to the next one? So for a typical student who moves through a method book in 6 months, that might be 2 to 3 songs a week. And for someone who's going faster, that might be 4 to 5 pieces a week, probably even more, depending on how fast they're going through the book. Now, I want to make a note that doesn't end up translating into learning 1 piece a day. So say you're learning 7 pieces a week. That doesn't mean that it's a good idea to learn 1 piece one day and then start a brand new piece the next day and a brand new piece the next day. You can do that as long as you're going back and playing the first piece. You're not just spending 1 day per piece, because music needs time to marinate. So what you'll often find is that you can learn a piece in a day and play it pretty well. and then the next day go back to it, and suddenly there's like some things that have fallen out of place, and there's a couple of rusty spots. And you'll generally find that if you return to the same piece for a few days, you'll eventually conquer those rusty spots. What you want to be able to do is play a piece well on your first try. And that's why I feel like about a week with a piece is the right amount of time for most of my students. And any less time than that, you run the risk of just kind of like glossing over a big part of that learning process. So if you find yourself in a situation where you're learning a piece a day or something like that and just kind of like forgetting it forever afterwards, I would consider that cutting corners. But if you're returning to the pieces you learned for at least a few days afterwards, I think that's totally fine and you're probably doing okay. So the third question would be, how well did you learn the material? Now, not every piece you learn has to be like a masterpiece, and I don't expect that in my studio, but I would say that like a good rule of thumb would be to learn a piece to like 80% decency with maybe higher diligence to pieces that you really, really like. So out of every 3 songs a student might learn, maybe 2 of them are around 80% and 1 of them's closer to 100%. The thing is that some people, most people I would say, have a really difficult time with self-assessment. Now, certain things in music are easy to tell if you're doing wrong. Like a lot of people can pick out if they're playing wrong notes, but people tend to have a harder time picking out if they're playing wrong rhythms. So you have to be really, really careful when you're trying to make a decision on whether or not a piece you're playing is good enough, because to you, you're like, okay, this sounds pretty good, but maybe objectively, there are quite a few errors. And that's why having a piano teacher is so useful, because the self-assessment is really, really challenging. So for someone who's progressing through the books really fast, I would just want to make sure they were being diligent about the details too, that they weren't just kind of like learning the notes and the rhythm and then moving on, but also making sure they're paying attention to like slurs, accents, dynamics, that kind of thing, because those are only going to get more challenging as the music gets more challenging. So it's important to get a grasp on reading and integrating them in the early stages. So if you thought about these questions and you feel pretty good about them, then by all means, go ahead, move quickly. You're probably on the right track. Just be really careful that you're not letting your excitement and enthusiasm to move on to the next thing make you skip important learning steps along the way. Final thing I want to talk about when it comes to progressing quickly through levels are growth spurts. And these are really interesting, and I usually see them happen with teenage students. Usually with people who've been playing since they were kids or maybe a little bit older. I find that once they hit their teen years, suddenly they're just out of nowhere almost ready for difficult repertoire that they weren't ready for before. So maybe they're playing like grade 4 stuff, and then all of a sudden they're like showing capabilities of playing grade 8 stuff. That's awesome. And my reaction to this is usually to just roll with it. So if it typically takes them about a year to go through a level, we might go through the next year where they're moving through 2 or 3 levels, and balancing that earlier music, like the grade 5, 6 music, with pieces that are going to challenge them more, like grade 8, 9 level pieces. This is a really exciting time for students, because all of a sudden it's like, wow, I'm like a real piano player now. But still, even though I kind of work with their growth spurt, we don't skip over intermediate repertoire. That's like, if there's any takeaway from this video that you have, don't skip over the really important basics. These growth spurts also don't usually go on indefinitely. Usually they'll happen like for a year or so, and then they're kind of back to their normal 1 grade a year level. And if you've never experienced one of these growth spurts, some people don't, and maybe you won't, or maybe one's right around the corner. They are really fun when they happen, and don't hold yourself back with music that's too easy when this happens to you, if it does. But just be careful that you're not going so fast that you're skipping over really important stuff. If you go straight from minuet to G to a Chopin nocturne and you skip out all that middle stuff, you'll still be able to play the notes of the Chopin nocturne. You'll still be able to maybe, play it with some amount of accuracy, but I've adjudicated music festivals before, and the thing that it's always really, really obvious to listen to people who've skipped these steps, because some of the subtlety of playing is lost. It's like they can hit the notes and they can do the rhythm, but all of the interpretation suffers when you don't kind of go through all those training steps. It's something that I see, it's really, really common, like hearing bad versions of popular advanced level pieces. Anyway, that is all for today's Q&A session. If you have a question of your own, please feel free to leave it in the comments below. That's usually where I mine for ideas for the next Q&A, which I think we'll do in 2 weeks. So yeah, leave your questions here if you have any, and I will get to them in the next video. Catch you later. Part of learning a musical instrument. My voice jumped there. I'm gonna just say that whole thing again.